June 4th, 1944, 2 days before D-Day. The radio room was supposed to be silent, completely silent. Radio silence protocol. No transmissions, no broadcasts, no exceptions. The order had come down from the highest levels of Allied command. Every ship in the invasion fleet, thousands of them, gathered in ports across southern England, had been told the same thing. Shut down. Go dark. Don't give the Germans any chance to intercept communications and discover what was coming. Private First Class. Daniel Hayes sat in the cramped radio room of a destroyer escort anchored off Portsmouth, staring at equipment he wasn't allowed to touch. His hands rested on the desk, not moving, not reaching for the dials, because touching that radio without authorization meant court-martial, maybe worse. But through the porthole, Hayes could see something that made his stomach turn. 3 Liberty ships, cargo vessels loaded with troops, tanks, ammunition, everything needed for the invasion. And they were heading in the wrong direction. Not toward France, toward a German naval patrol route. Hayes looked at the clock. 7 hours. He looked at the radio. Silent. Dead. He looked back at the ships, still moving, still heading toward disaster. Someone had made a mistake, a navigation error, a miscommunication. It didn't matter what caused it. What mattered was that in less than 20 minutes, those ships would sail directly into German waters, where U-boats waited, where patrol vessels hunted, where 3,000 American soldiers would die before the invasion even began. Hayes reached for the radio. His hand hovered over the power switch. He knew the rules, knew the consequences, but he also knew that staying silent meant watching those ships disappear over the horizon and never come back. What Hayes didn't know, what he couldn't have predicted, was that the next 8 minutes would force him to choose between following orders and saving lives, and that his decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. Not because it was wrong, but because no one would ever thank him for it. Who was Daniel Hayes? Daniel Patrick. Hayes was born in the winter of 1922 in a small town outside Boston that most maps forgot to include. His father worked at a rail yard. His mother took in sewing to help pay the rent. They weren't poor. Not exactly. But they understood what it meant to work for everything and expect nothing. Daniel learned early that the world didn't care about what you deserved, only what you did. He was a quiet kid, the kind who sat in the back of the classroom, never raised his hand, but always knew the answer when the teacher called on him. He liked radios, not just listening to them, understanding how they worked. By age 12, he'd built his own crystal set from spare parts he'd scavenged from the rail yard. His father found him one night, hunched over the kitchen table, soldering wire by candlelight. "What is that?" his father asked. "Radio," Daniel said. "Does it work?" Daniel twisted a dial. Static crackled. Then, faint but clear, a voice. A baseball game, from Philadelphia, over 200 miles away. His father stared. "How?" Daniel shrugged. "Radio waves. They're always there. You just have to know how to catch them." That was Daniel. Practical. Quiet. Good with his hands and better with his mind. He didn't talk much. Didn't need to. He understood systems. How things connected. How information moved from one place to another. And more than that, he understood that sometimes knowing something wasn't enough. You had to act on it, even when acting meant risking everything. When Pearl Harbor happened in December 1941, Daniel didn't rush to enlist, not because he didn't care, but because he was practical. He waited, watched, saw which branches needed what skills. Then in March of 1942, he walked into a Navy recruiting office and told them he knew radios. They tested him. Morse code, circuit diagrams, signal theory. Daniel passed everything. Not barely. Perfectly. The recruiter looked at his scores and said, "You'll be a radio man." Daniel nodded. That was fine. He didn't need to be a hero. He just needed to be useful. By June of 1944, Daniel had spent 2 years aboard destroyers and escorts, learning not just how radios worked, but how war worked, how information moved, how orders were given, how one message, sent at the right time, could save a convoy, or doom it. He'd learned something else, too. That rules existed for a reason, that breaking them had consequences, and that sometimes the hardest thing to do wasn't following orders. It was knowing when not to. What Daniel didn't know yet, what no training could have prepared him for, was that in less than 2 days, the largest invasion in human history would begin. And the only thing standing between success and catastrophe would be one radio man who understood that silence, sometimes, was the most dangerous sound of all. The plan that couldn't fail, Operation Overlord. The code name for D-Day. The Allied invasion of Normandy. Years in the planning, months in the preparation. And now, in early June of 1944, just days away. The plan was enormous. Over 150,000 troops would land on 5 beaches along the Normandy coast, supported by 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and the hope that surprise, speed, and overwhelming force would break through Hitler's Atlantic Wall. But surprise was everything. If the Germans knew when and where the invasion was coming, they could reinforce the beaches, move their panzer divisions into position, turn the landing zones into killing fields. So secrecy was paramount. Deception operations, false intelligence, and above all, radio silence. Absolute. Total. No ship in the invasion fleet was allowed to transmit, not to coordinate movements, not to report position, not for any reason. Because the Germans had listening stations all along the French coast, sophisticated equipment that could intercept Allied communications, direction-finding arrays that could pinpoint the location of a transmission within minutes. One broadcast, one mistake, and the entire invasion could be compromised. The order was clear, from General Eisenhower himself. Radio silence until H hour. No exceptions. Daniel Hayes understood this. Everyone did. It wasn't just a rule. It was the difference between victory and slaughter. So when his ship, the destroyer escort USS Benson, anchored off Portsmouth on June 3rd, Daniel shut down his equipment, locked the transmitter, and sat in silence, watching, waiting, ready to listen but forbidden to speak. Through the porthole he could see the harbor, dozens of ships, maybe hundreds, Liberty ships, troop transports, tank landing craft, all of them waiting for the same order. Go. But the weather was bad. Heavy clouds, rough seas. The invasion, originally scheduled for June 5th, had been postponed. 24 hours, maybe more. So they waited, in silence. And the longer they waited, the more Daniel felt the weight of that silence. Because silence, he'd learned, wasn't safety. It was a gamble. A bet that nothing would go wrong. That every ship knew where it was supposed to be. That every crew understood the plan. That no one would make a mistake. But people always made mistakes, especially under pressure, especially in war. Daniel just hoped that when the mistake happened, and it would happen, it wouldn't cost lives. What he didn't know yet, what he couldn't have seen coming, was that the mistake was already in motion, and he had less than 8 minutes to stop it. The mistake. June 4th, 0340 hours. A navigation officer aboard the Liberty ship SHS Thomas Paine made a calculation error. Not a big one, just a few degrees. But at sea, a few degrees over 20 miles meant the difference between the right course and sailing directly into enemy waters. The Thomas Paine was leading a small convoy, 3 ships total, loaded with troops, vehicles, ammunition. Everything needed for the invasion's second wave. They were supposed to move from Portsmouth to a holding area 15 miles south. Safe waters, protected by minesweepers, under Allied air cover. But the navigation officer, exhausted from 48 hours without sleep, transposed 2 numbers on his chart. Instead of heading south-southwest, the convoy turned south-southeast, toward the Channel, toward France, toward German patrol routes. No one noticed at first. The ships moved through the darkness, engines rumbling, no lights, no radio. Silent. And in that silence, the mistake compounded. Because without radio communication, no one could confirm their position. No one could check their course. They just followed the lead ship, assuming it knew where it was going. Daniel Hayes, sitting in his radio room on the destroyer escort Benson, anchored 3 miles away, saw them through the porthole. At first, he didn't think anything of it. Ships moved all the time, repositioning, adjusting. But something about their heading bothered him. He'd been tracking convoys for 2 years. He knew the patterns, knew the routes, and this convoy was moving wrong. Daniel pulled out a chart, drew a line from the ship's last known position to where they appeared to be heading, and his stomach dropped. They were sailing directly toward the Baie de la Seine, German waters, where U-boats patrolled, where coastal defense batteries waited, where minefields had been laid months earlier. If those ships continued on their current course, they'd cross into enemy territory in less than 20 minutes. And once they did, the Germans would sink them. All 3. Daniel looked at his radio. Silent. Dead. He could warn them. 1 transmission. 8 words. Convoy heading 140. You are off course. That's all it would take. But the order was clear. No transmissions. No exceptions. Daniel's mind raced. If he transmitted, the Germans might intercept it, might use it to pinpoint Allied positions, might realize the invasion was imminent. But if he didn't transmit, 3 ships would die. 3,000 men. Daniel stared at the radio, at the clock, at the ships, still moving, still heading toward disaster. He thought about the rules, about orders, about what he'd been taught. And then he thought about something else, about his father, standing in that kitchen years ago, watching a boy catch radio waves from 200 miles away. They're always there, Daniel had said. You just have to know how to catch them. But catching them wasn't enough. You had to use them. Daniel reached for the power switch. His hand didn't shake, not from fear, but from certainty. Because in that moment, he understood something that no manual could teach, that rules existed to save lives. And when following them meant losing lives, they stopped being rules. They became excuses. Daniel flipped the switch. The radio hummed to life. And in 8 words, he broke the most important order of the war. What Daniel didn't know, what he couldn't have predicted, was that his transmission wouldn't just save 3 ships. It would trigger a chain of events that would force Allied command to rethink everything they thought they knew about communication, risk, and the cost of silence. 8 words. Daniel keyed the microphone. His voice was steady, calm, professional. Convoy heading 140. You are off course. He released the key. Waited. 5 seconds. 10. Nothing. Maybe they hadn't heard. Maybe their radio was off. Maybe... Static crackled. A voice, confused. Say again? Daniel keyed again. Convoy heading 140. You are off course. Turn to heading 190. Immediate. Another pause. Then? Who is this? Identify. Daniel didn't answer that. He just repeated. Turn to heading 190. You are heading toward enemy patrol zone. This time, the response was faster. Understood. Turning now. Daniel watched through the porthole. Slowly. So slowly, it almost looked like they weren't moving at all. The lead ship began to turn. Then the second. Then the third. Back toward safe waters. Away from the Germans. Daniel exhaled. He'd done it. Saved them. But the cost was just beginning, because his transmission, brief as it was, had been heard. Not just by the convoy, by everyone. Every ship in the fleet with a radio receiver. every Allied listening post along the coast. And Daniel's blood ran cold, possibly by the Germans. Within seconds, his radio crackled again. This time, a different voice, harder, angrier. "Benson radio operator, you are ordered to identify immediately. Who authorized that transmission?" Daniel stared at the microphone. He could lie. Say it was an emergency, a malfunction. But lying wouldn't help. The transmission had been recorded, logged. His voice was on tape. "Private First Class Hayes," he said quietly. "No authorization." Silence. Then, "You are ordered to shut down immediately and report to your commanding officer." Daniel flipped the switch. The radio went silent again. He sat in the darkness, hands shaking now. Not from fear of punishment, but from the realization of what he'd just done. He'd broken the most important rule of the entire operation. He'd transmitted during radio silence, and if the Germans had intercepted it, if they'd used it to triangulate Allied positions, if they'd realized the invasion was coming, Daniel wouldn't just face court-martial. He'd be responsible for compromising D-Day itself. But he'd also saved 3 ships, 3,000 men. And as Daniel sat there, waiting for someone to come arrest him, he realized something. He didn't regret it, not for a second. Because rules, he'd learned, weren't about blindly following orders. They were about understanding when the situation demanded something else. What Daniel didn't know yet, what he wouldn't learn for hours, was that his transmission had done something no one expected. It had been heard, not by the Germans, but by Allied intelligence, and they'd been listening for something else entirely, something that would change everything. The intercept. 60 miles away, in a concrete bunker outside London, a British intelligence officer named Captain Edward Marsh sat at a radio monitoring station. His job was simple. Listen. Not for Allied communications, but for German ones. The Germans had their own radio discipline, their own protocols, but they also had patrol boats, U-boats, coastal defense units. All of them communicated regularly, and Allied intelligence listened to everything, not to decode every message. That took time, but to track patterns, to understand where German forces were concentrated, where they expected threats. At 03:48 hours on June 4th, Marsh heard something unusual. A brief Allied transmission. American. Clear. "Convoy heading 140. You are off course." Marsh frowned. Radio silence was absolute. Why would someone break it? Then, less than 30 seconds later, he heard something else. A German transmission. From a coastal listening post near Cherbourg. Encrypted, but brief, and, Marsh's training told him, probably routine. But the timing bothered him. An Allied transmission. Then a German response, 30 seconds apart. Marsh pulled the German message, sent it to the codebreakers, waited. 2 hours later, the decrypt came back. Possible Allied transmission detected, origin uncertain, content unclear. No action required. Marsh read it twice. Then he understood. The Germans had heard the transmission, but they hadn't understood it. They didn't know it was a warning to a convoy. They thought it was routine chatter, maybe a test, maybe a malfunction. They didn't realize it was connected to the invasion. Marsh picked up the phone, called Allied Naval Command. "You need to know something," he said. "We had a breach of radio silence this morning, but it worked in our favor." The officer on the other end listened as Marsh explained. Then, "Find out who made that transmission. I want to talk to him." The interrogation. Daniel Hayes sat in a small office aboard the Benson. Not a cell, not officially under arrest, but not free to leave either. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Paul Gresham, sat across from him. Silent. Gresham was a career Navy man, by the book, disciplined. He didn't yell, didn't need to. His silence said everything. Finally, You broke radio silence. Yes, sir. Without authorization. Yes, sir. Knowing the consequences. Yes, sir. Gresham leaned back. Why? Daniel looked at him. 3 ships were heading into enemy waters. I had maybe 15 minutes before they crossed the line. I couldn't get authorization in time. So you decided to make the call yourself? Yes, sir. Gresham stared at him. Do you understand what you risked? If the Germans had intercepted that transmission, if they'd used it to locate the fleet, you could have compromised the entire invasion. I understand, sir. But you did it anyway. I did. Gresham shook his head. You're either the bravest man I've ever met, or the stupidest. Maybe both, sir. For the first time, Gresham almost smiled. Almost. Then a knock at the door. An officer entered, handed Gresham a message. Gresham read it. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. He looked at Daniel. You're wanted in London. Daniel blinked. Sir? Intelligence wants to talk to you. Now, the meeting that changed everything. Daniel stood in a room he didn't belong in. Maps on every wall. Officers with ranks he'd only seen in photographs. And at the center, Captain Edward Marsh. Private Hayes, Marsh said. Sir, tell me about your transmission. Daniel did. Simply. No excuses. No justifications. Just what happened. When he finished, Marsh nodded. You saved 3 ships. Yes, sir. You also gave us something else. Daniel frowned. Sir, the Germans heard you, but they didn't understand. They logged it as routine noise, which tells us something important. Marsh walked to a map. Their listening posts aren't as sophisticated as we feared. They're hearing us, but they're not processing fast enough, which means we can communicate if we're smart about it. He turned back to Daniel. Your transmission shouldn't have worked, but it did. Not just because you saved those ships, but because you showed us that selective, brief, targeted communication can work even under radio silence. Daniel didn't know what to say. Marsh continued. We're not going to court-martial you. We're going to study what you did, and we're going to use it. June 6th, 1944. 2 days later, the invasion began. Daniel Hayes was back in his radio room, still under orders, still under radio silence. But now, Allied Command had a new protocol. Brief, targeted, emergency only. Communication was allowed, if it saved lives. Daniel didn't transmit that day, didn't need to. But he listened. And as the reports came in, as thousands of men stormed the beaches of Normandy, Daniel understood something. That rules existed for a reason, but so did judgment. And sometimes, the most important thing a soldier could do wasn't follow orders. It was know when to break them. Years later, after the war, Daniel never talked about what happened that night. Not because he was ashamed, but because it didn't feel like something worth celebrating. He'd done what needed to be done. That was all. He returned to Boston in 1946, worked for a radio station, eventually became chief engineer, spent 40 years making sure signals reached people who needed to hear them. He never made headlines, never received a medal for that transmission. The Navy quietly buried the incident in classified files that wouldn't be opened for 50 years. But the 3 ships he saved, the SS Thomas Paine, the SS Liberty Bell, and the SS Franklin, all made it to Normandy. All delivered their cargo. All contributed to the invasion that liberated Europe. And the 3,000 men aboard them went home after the war, had families, lived lives. Most of them never knew they'd been sailing toward disaster. Never knew that one radio man broke the rules to save them. Daniel Hayes died in 1995, quietly, in a nursing home outside Boston. His obituary mentioned his work at the radio station, his service in the Navy. Nothing about D-Day, nothing about the transmission. Because some stories don't get told. Not because they're not important, but because the people who lived them never thought they were worth telling. The lesson buried in silence. This story isn't in the history books. It's not taught at Annapolis. There's no memorial to Daniel Hayes, no plaque commemorating the transmission that saved 3 ships. But it should be remembered, not because it was heroic, but because it was human. Daniel Hayes understood something that no training manual teaches, that rules exist to create order. But order isn't the same as doing what's right. Sometimes, doing what's right means breaking the rules. Not carelessly, not rebelliously, but thoughtfully, with full understanding of the consequences, and accepting those consequences because the alternative, staying silent while people die, is worse than any punishment. The military teaches obedience, for good reason. Discipline saves lives. Structure prevents chaos, but discipline without judgment becomes rigidity, and rigidity in the wrong moment kills. Daniel Hayes had 8 seconds to make a choice: follow orders and watch 3 ships sail to their deaths, or break the most important rule of the war and save them. He chose to save them. And in doing so, he taught the Allied command something they hadn't considered: that communication, even during radio silence, could be a weapon. If used carefully, if used wisely. After Hayes's transmission, protocols changed. Not officially, not in writing, but commanders understood that absolute rules sometimes needed absolute exceptions. That's the real lesson. Not that breaking rules is good, but that understanding when and why to break them is what separates a good soldier from a great one. Daniel Hayes was never promoted for what he did, never decorated, never even formally acknowledged. But the men on those 3 ships lived, and that, for Hayes, was decoration enough. Because at the end of the day, war isn't about medals. It's about making choices that let people go home, even if no one ever thanks you, even if history forgets your name. Daniel Hayes understood that. And on June 4th, 1944, in 8 words transmitted through the darkness, he proved that sometimes the most important voice is the one that refuses to stay silent.